lo ringrazio per la sua disponibilità di coordinare questa conferenza e mi ha detto di sì. Vi lascio la parola al professor Bacciaglietta e benvenuti ancora.
Just a welcome introduction, principal. Siamo molto contenti di avere qui stasera Dan Falk, il nostro fiore all'occhiello internazionale quest'anno, nella seconda edizione del Festival di Conoscenza. Qualche parola per presentarlo, perché poi per quanto riguarda la sua presentazione ci saranno immagini che vedrete scorrere sullo schermo, qualche parola di traduzione da parte mia, spero non tante, perché credo che possiate essere tranquillamente in grado di seguire l'argomento. We're very happy to have you here, Mr. Dan Falk, and this is the international event for this year. This is the second edition of Conoscenza, the Science Festival organized inside this institution. Just some words to introduce you. Dan Falk è uno scrittore e giornalista freelance di origini canadesi, di successo, specializzato in storia della scienza e divulgazione scientifica. Nel 2002 ha pubblicato Universe on a T-shirt, alla ricerca della teoria del tutto. Il sottotitolo è The Quest for the Theory of Everything. Nel 2008 ha pubblicato In Search of Time, The History, Physics and Philosophy of Time, sulla storia, la fisica e la filosofia del tempo. E nel 2011-2012 è stato Knight Science Journalism Fellow, praticamente ha vinto una possibilità di essere ricercatore presso il prestigioso MIT di Boston, il Massachusetts Institute of Technology di Boston, lavorando e facendo grandi esperienze in un centro di ricerca internazionale di grande rilievo. Ha scritto e continua a scrivere su riviste come The Smithsonian, New Scientist, The Globe and Mail, Astronomy, Sky and Telescope. Inoltre produttore di programmi radiofonici che riguardano la divulgazione scientifica, e gestisce un sito, un blog, sul quale sono pubblicate recensioni in podcast e che vi invito a andare a frequentare perché è estremamente interessante. danfolk.ca. That's in Italian, I think that's all. Dan.
Okay, yes, thank you for that introduction. Should we begin?
Yes, l'inserimento nell'ambito del tema trasformazioni è dovuto alla tematica che andremo ad affrontare. Mi piacerebbe leggere rapidamente dal suo libro Universe on a T-shirt una pagina nella quale ha mirabilmente sintetizzato le trasformazioni che sono avvenute nella storia, che ci possono interessare e ci interesseranno oggi, tra la fine del 600 e gli inizi del 700, un periodo di straordinario impatto nella cultura europea. I'm going to read them in Italian, just for a few moments, a page from your Universe on a T-shirt, in which, introducing the century, at the end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th, you synthesize, you summarize the great impact of personalities, various personalities inside the European and worldwide culture. I decenni finali del 600 e i decenni finali del 500 e gli inizi del 700 sono stati un periodo di radicali cambiamenti sociali, culturali in tutta Europa. È un periodo di enorme creatività nell'ambito delle scienze, delle arti, della letteratura. Il teatro inglese è fiorito sotto la regina Elisabetta I, mentre la lingua inglese si arricchiva delle opere teatrali, delle poesie di William Shakespeare e, sotto il regno di Re Giacomo, di una nuova traduzione della Bibbia. Miguel de Cervantes perfezionava una nuova forma letteraria in quegli anni con il suo romanzo Don Chisciotte. E il greco dipingeva dei paesaggi brulli e drammatici, mentre Caravaggio e Rubens introducevano una nuova vitalità sulla tela. Il mondo scientifico era anche in mezzo a enormi trasformazioni. William Harvey rivoluzionava la medicina scoprendo come il sangue circola attraverso il corpo. Mercator aveva appena prodotto il suo Atlante completo e anche la matematica era diventata adulta. Erano stati inventati i logaritmi e si diffondeva la simbologia decimale. E Cartesio, René Descartes, noto per la sua filosofia come penso dunque sono, ma anche brillante matematico, avrebbe ben presto gettato le fondamenta nuove per l'algebra e per la geometria. E soprattutto, torreggiante, towering è l'aggettivo che utilizza Dan, c'era il matematico e astronomo italiano Galileo Galilei. Questo periodo cade in mezzo a quello che viene chiamato adesso rivoluzione scientifica, cioè quel gruppo di scoperte che si estende approssimativamente da Copernico a Newton. Il termine fu coniato dagli storici soltanto agli inizi del XX secolo, ma l'impatto di queste scoperte è oltre ogni dubbio. Hanno definito un modo nuovo e razionale di vedere il mondo, basato sulla scienza empirica e sulla deduzione matematica. È stata in questo periodo la più grande abbondanza di idee che il mondo abbia mai conosciuto. The greatest flood of new ideas the world had ever seen. Questo è quello che dice Dan in una introduzione del libro, o in un'introduzione di un capitolo, Universe of a T-shirt. Quindi da questo quadro sintetico, riepilogativo che ci fa capire l'importanza del periodo in cui Shakespeare ha operato, le idee del libro La scienza di Shakespeare, un nuovo modo di guardare l'universo del drammaturgo. So Dan, why a new look of the playwright's universe?
Well, first of all, so thank you again for that introduction. I appreciate it. I'm very glad to be here, and hello again to the audience watching. Yes, you know, very much has been written about Shakespeare over the years, and it's a good question. Why continue to write about Shakespeare? Hasn't everything been said? But I think, hopefully, I've succeeded to show Shakespeare in a new light, a different perspective. I think very often when you read a Shakespeare biography, or maybe you take a Shakespeare class in university, and they don't say very much about science because the two subjects are not seen to be related. But I think they are. I don't think this is some radical new, I don't think we need to rewrite the books on Shakespeare. But I think it's very interesting and illuminating to think about the developments in science that were happening. As you noted in the passage from Universe on a T-shirt, this actually was a period of tremendous change. And I thought it would be interesting to see what impact this had in Shakespeare's works, and just more generally, because you can argue about how large or small the impact was, but more generally to use Shakespeare's works as a kind of lens to just look at these really very transformative developments in what we now call science.
May I translate just something? Allora, per sintetizzare, vediamo di sintetizzare ogni volta dopo un intervento di Dan. È uno degli aspetti meno, diciamo, investigati, quello dell'impatto della scienza su Shakespeare, perché ci sono tantissime cose, è stato detto tantissimo, corsi universitari, lezioni e conferenze trattano Shakespeare sotto tantissimi punti di vista, però probabilmente l'aspetto dell'impatto della scienza sulle sue opere è meno trattato. Il libro non propone una teoria radicale, completamente nuova, però è una forma di investigazione sicuramente interessante. Okay, you can go on.
Oh, shall I begin?
Yes.
I'll try to click on share screen.
Yeah.
So this will take just a moment. Well, now we have to find the actual presentation. Whoops. Okay, hold on. One moment, let me try it this way. Oops, that's the wrong screen. This is the one.
La presentazione viene condotta in remoto da Dan, adesso tra un po' avremo l'insieme delle slide che vedremo. Questa è la presentazione specificamente su Amleto.
Is it working so far? You can see,
yes.
You see the title slide?
Yes, yes.
Okay, very good. So, yes, I'm going to talk about Shakespeare and science, and I'm going to focus in particular on the play Hamlet for a few reasons, but partly because it's perhaps Shakespeare's greatest play, arguably. Perhaps his most famous play, and you can find a lot of very interesting things in Hamlet, including some very interesting connections to astronomy. So I guess I will get started. Okay, so as I was mentioning earlier, we don't often think of Shakespeare and science together, and I think there are several reasons for that, but one of them is that modern science, as we think of it today, didn't really exist in Shakespeare's time, and instead there were many other ways of seeing things: astrology, witchcraft, and magic of various kinds were all very much part of the worldview, and because of that, when we think of Shakespeare, we sometimes think of these much older ideas rather than thinking about science. Shall I pause for a moment?
Yeah, ok. Ovviamente per quanto riguarda l'aspetto della scienza, l'ho già detto prima, all'epoca non c'era la scienza intesa come la intendiamo noi oggi, il termine è stato coniato qualche secolo dopo, però si può parlare di vari argomenti scientifici trattati da Shakespeare, tra cui l'astronomia, la medicina, qualcosa che aveva a che fare anche con, ovviamente tanto, l'astrologia e la magia, che poi sconfinavano nell'ambito scientifico regolarmente. Ok?
Okay. But at the same time, it was an age of discovery, and for example, new lands, new worlds were being explored, discovered and explored. Of course, they were not new lands for the people already living there, but they were new for the Europeans who were setting sail to find them for the first time. And there were also new discoveries about the human body. Those who know a little bit about the history of medicine will know that Vesalius was writing something like a modern textbook about human anatomy at the same time as Copernicus published his book. So 1543, I'm not going to mention very many dates, but one date to remember is 1543, when both Vesalius and Copernicus published their books. Shall I pause for a moment?
Yes. Per quanto riguarda il periodo, grandi scoperte geografiche, il mondo esterno, ma anche scoperte di anatomia, quindi il corpo umano, scoperte fondamentali in questo periodo, che coinvolgevano un po' tutto il mondo intellettuale del tempo. Okay?
And also, there were new ideas about the universe, and of course that is what I explore in the book most of all. So, in this image on the left-hand side, you see the traditional ancient view of the cosmos. Everything is centered on the Earth. And this is the geocentric or Earth-centered model that goes back to ancient times. The ancient Greeks described this in great detail, and it continued to be the prevalent view into the early Renaissance. But on the right-hand side, you see the new picture from Copernicus. This is a diagram from his famous book, De Revolutionibus, or in English, On the Revolutions. And here, the sun has been moved to the center of this system, and the Earth has taken its place as as we would say, the third rock from the sun, with the moon going around it, and the planets beyond that. So it's not, Copernicus was not the very first person to suggest this, because there were Greek thinkers who had written about it, but it just never caught on. So we do associate this idea with Copernicus. Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Quello che vedete sintetizzato con le immagini è sulla sinistra il mondo come era inteso da Tolomeo, geocentrico, con la Terra al centro e i pianeti, compreso il Sole, che giravano intorno. Invece dal 1543, quando è stato pubblicato il Revolutionibus di Copernico, questa è una incisione, una illustrazione all'interno del testo originario, le cose cambiano. La rivoluzione copernicana prevede il sistema eliocentrico, quindi al centro il Sole, e la Terra come la terza roccia che gira intorno, così come un pianeta insomma, che gira intorno al Sole, uno dei tanti. Quindi un passaggio nel tempo 1543 rispetto alla nascita di Shakespeare, siamo una ventina d'anni prima, quindi un impatto che sicuramente c'è stato sullo stesso autore. Ok?
Okay. And this is just a close-up view of the ancient view, and you can actually see the four elements that the Greeks believed everything was made from. So earth, air, fire, and water, and then surrounding it, the planets. Each planet was believed to be carried by an invisible sphere, a crystalline sphere, and then at the far outer perimeter, I know you can't see me pointing, but the so-called fixed stars. So on the outer edge you see the so-called fixed stars.
Sì, quest'altra immagine mette in evidenza la composizione che si riteneva all'epoca del mondo, dell'universo, i quattro elementi, terra, aria, acqua e fuoco, e anche nell'immagine l'idea del firmamento del cielo delle stelle fisse, che era appunto una delle teorie consolidate e accettate universalmente.
Okay, that's just I already mentioned the new Copernican view. So it was natural to ask, are there any signs of this in Shakespeare's works? And this is a difficult question. Shakespeare does not address issues of astronomy or cosmology directly the way some other writers do, but nonetheless, as you go through Shakespeare's works, you very often find references to the sun, the moon, eclipses, comets, meteors, planets, and stars, right? So these things are very often mentioned. He's not directly, giving you a science lesson. I think it's legitimate to ask, well, okay, so what about his interest in these subjects, and can we find anything that might hint at the new ideas of Copernicus?
Sì, Shakespeare non si rivolge direttamente, non utilizza direttamente argomenti scientifici nelle sue opere, ma molto spesso si rintracciano riferimenti ai pianeti, ai cometi, alle stelle, alle eclissi, al Sole, alla Luna, e quindi evidentemente c'era una percezione assolutamente diretta del mondo scientifico circostante.
So I'm going to talk about the play Hamlet, which I think hopefully everyone has some familiarity with. And I'm going to talk about the very famous opening scene where the guards are on duty at the castle of Elsinore, and a ghostly figure appears. Now it turns out this is the ghost of the king who died a short time earlier. Of course, it turns out he was murdered. And the dialogue is very interesting. They're joined by Horatio, who is a friend of Hamlet. And Horatio is asking the guards to tell them more about the ghost. You know, when does the ghost usually appear? And Bernardo, who is one of the guards, says, "Last night of all, when yon same star that's westward from the pole had made his course to illume that part of heaven where now it burns, Marcellus and myself, the bell then beating one." And he doesn't get to finish the thought because at that point the ghost appears, and so that's the end of that conversation. But scholars have been wondering, what star is Bernardo talking about? Yeah.
Okay, il focus dell'intervento di Dan è sulla scena di apertura di Amleto, in cui le guardie sui bastioni del castello, lì c'è un'atmosfera, una situazione di guerra in atto tra Danimarca e Norvegia, vedono il fantasma del re morto da poco e invitano a in qualche modo incontrare questo fantasma uno dei personaggi più rilevanti della tragedia, cioè Orazio, amico di Amleto. E questo riferimento, che è fatto da una delle due guardie, è alla stella che si trova a occidente del polo. L'abbiamo visto in questa direzione, in questo ambito, quindi un riferimento per quanto riguardava proprio l'orientamento che è tipicamente scientifico.
Yeah, this is good. I'm learning a little bit of Italian, so now I know that phantasma is ghost. So I'm learning something. Okay. So this is a scene that a few scholars have looked at, trying to figure out what object is being discussed. And the clues are in the text. We know what time it is because they tell us, the bell then beating one. So it's the middle of the night. And you can also figure out what time of year it is. I won't go through this in detail, but we know that it's 2 years have gone by since the death of the king, but the king was murdered when he was having a nap or resting outside in his garden, so it must have been warm enough for that, but now it's very cold because the guards are saying how cold it is at Elsinore. I don't know, you don't have to translate all of that maybe, but that's sort of how we know what time and what time of year, what time of night it is. So people have taken some guesses. Yeah, okay, I'll wait, sure.
Nel testo ci sono dei riferimenti molto precisi all'orario in cui l'ora in cui il fantasma si manifesta sui bastioni del castello, e anche il periodo che presumibilmente è tardo novembre, in quanto 2 mesi prima era venuto a mancare il re, morto insomma in giardino mentre era lì a riposare. Quindi ci sono precisi riferimenti al tempo, ben definiti, insomma, anche scientificamente.
So one possibility is that it is a planet. So a few Shakespeare scholars have put forward that guess. Another writer suggested that it might be the star Capella. So Capella is a bright star in the winter sky. But there are some problems with both of those guesses, and I will try not to get too technical here. But a planet cannot appear anywhere in the sky. A planet can only be on what astronomers call the ecliptic. On the left-hand side of the sky chart, you can see a dotted line. It's actually labeled ecliptic. So a planet has to be somewhere on this line. It's just because the solar system is flat, right? So all of the planets are orbiting in a plane, like a frisbee or a pizza. So a planet cannot just be anywhere, and so a planet cannot really be westward from the pole, as the text said. And I also mentioned that there was this idea that it's the star Capella. So if you look closely, you can see Capella near the center of this diagram, which means it is nearly overhead in the sky. But the dialogue, when they're speaking, they don't say that it was overhead, they say westward from the pole. So both of these guesses, a planet or the star Capella, are not very good guesses.
Ok, a proposito delle conoscenze astronomiche di Shakespeare, perché questa stella a occidente del polo ha indotto i critici a pensare a due soluzioni: un pianeta, ma il pianeta per individuarlo ha bisogno di determinati punti di riferimento, si parla di eclittiche, entriamo nel dettaglio insomma più specifico, oppure una stella luminosa, Capella, che però in quel periodo dell'anno e in quel particolare momento era un po' difficile da individuare nello schema così planetario. Ok?
So yes, as I say, I think there are some problems with both of these guesses. So what could it be? We know it's. I'll just for a moment let me go back here to the diagram. The pole star is just to the right of the center. It's labeled Polaris on the diagram. And westward from the pole, we look a little bit to the left, and we see Cassiopeia. And those of you who know the sky will know Cassiopeia. It's shaped like a W or an M. But the problem is there isn't really a bright star in Cassiopeia. There isn't really anything that stands out. However, there used to be a bright star in Cassiopeia 400 years ago. And this was what we now call a supernova, or also historians call it Tycho's star, a new star that appeared in the sky in 1572.
Sì, la possibile soluzione può essere che nel 1572, quindi Shakespeare era bambino, l'ha potuta vedere nel cielo, appare una supernova, che è un evento straordinario nel tempo, nei secoli, e fu denominata la stella di Tycho dal noto astronomo danese. E quindi probabilmente questo riferimento che fa Shakespeare, sottovalutato dai critici probabilmente, ma invece andando a fondo nel lavoro da ricercatore, appunto come quello di Dan, potrebbe essere un'allusione a questo fenomeno particolarmente visibile dappertutto e che fece scalpore dell'apparizione nel cielo della supernova di Tycho. Okay.
So let me say a little bit about this man, Tycho Brahe, the Danish astronomer who observed the supernova. This actually made him quite famous, and scholars were. This was a very interesting and unexpected sight. The ancient Greeks, the realm of the stars is perfect. It's never changing. So for a new star to appear, it's a very strange, a very frightening thing, and people wanted to know what it meant. Even Queen Elizabeth was wondering what the implications were. And let me just see. Yeah. So when Shakespeare, well, okay, so let me just go back. This was 1572. Shakespeare was only a young child, right? So it's, you could say, well, you know, is he really going to remember something that happened in the sky when he was 8 years old? But the thing is, it was visible, of course this is not it, this is just a photograph, a current contemporary photograph, but it was visible in the sky for more than a year. And remember, in those days, there was no television, no internet, no video games, so I think people actually looked at the sky a lot more than they do today. Of course, I mean, it was England, so often it was cloudy. But if it was clear, and remember this was before the light pollution, right? So today, if you live in a city, you can't see very much, right? Because there's so many city lights and lights from cars and factories. But in Shakespeare's time, this was a part, I think it was a part of everyone's life. It was part of the scenery, and something like a new star appearing in the sky, I think, was a very big deal.
Sì, si può dire che fu un evento clamoroso, eclatante all'epoca, anche se Shakespeare era piccolino, però per esempio la comparsa di questo astro nel cielo sconvolse anche la regina Elisabetta, prima volle sapere di più, all'epoca tra l'altro si guardava molto di più il cielo. Non c'era l'inquinamento luminoso che abbiamo noi oggi, quindi era davvero uno scenario fantastico, e un'esperienza del genere probabilmente Shakespeare, nato nel 1564, quindi nel 72 aveva 8-9 anni, 10 anni, sicuramente gli è rimasta dentro e ha potuto quindi utilizzarla, questa immagine, anche all'interno delle sue opere, nel caso di Hamlet.
And also, people were writing about this star. So the historian Hollinshead wrote about it in his book, his Chronicles, and that's important because we know Hollinshead's Chronicles was a source for Shakespeare, right? We know that Shakespeare was using this book and referring to it, and it actually went through multiple editions when Shakespeare was an adult. So remember, I said that the star appeared when Shakespeare was a very young child, only 8 years old, but later as an adult, he would have this reminder about the star that had appeared in his childhood. I can pause there, I guess.
I told them about this event.
Okay, thanks. So let me just provide a little extra context of some of the other figures who were important at this time. Copernicus I've already mentioned just briefly, and Galileo, very important figure, especially moving the paths that you were reading earlier from Universe on the t-shirt, but he comes later in the timeline. So by the time that Galileo is looking through his telescope, it's towards the end of Shakespeare's writing career. Now I have more in the book, of course. I say more about some possible connections to Galileo, but let me just leave it at that for the moment. And I briefly mentioned Tycho Brahe, the Danish astronomer. He was the greatest. He was the greatest observer of the sky in Shakespeare's time, the greatest of the pre-telescopic observers, and he was contemporary with Shakespeare. And finally, I need to introduce one of the important English astronomers who had, I think, possibly a close connection to Shakespeare, and that is the astronomer Thomas Digges. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a painting of Thomas Digges, but I mentioned him because of an important role he played in spreading the word of the Copernican theory. So I mentioned that Copernicus's book was published 1543. So it was before Shakespeare was born, right? It was 20 years before Shakespeare was born. It was a very difficult book. It was in Latin, of course, and it's very technical, very mathematical. But Thomas Digges writes an almanac. An almanac gives you predictions of eclipses and weather predictions and that sort of thing. But it includes a chapter saying how great the Copernican theory is and sort of popularizing it in English for an English audience. So that's very interesting. It's the first popularization of the new theory, making it accessible for people like Shakespeare and anyone else.
E in collegamento con Shakespeare, a parte Copernico di cui ha parlato prima, pubblica nel 1543, ci sono anche queste figure. Galileo in primo luogo, che nasce lo stesso anno di Shakespeare, quindi è un perfetto contemporaneo, e che però pubblica un testo fondamentale nel 1610, quando Shakespeare sta quasi ultimando la sua carriera di drammaturgo. Quindi la citazione, il riferimento all'astronomo danese Tycho Brahe, e l'altro, non ci sono immagini sfortunatamente per Thomas Digges, che è un astronomo inglese che in lingua inglese traduce una parte del suo del testo.
Yeah, you can still hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Copernicus had put the sun in the center, and you see that again here in Thomas Digges' diagram. But he has done something different, which is that the stars now are no longer restricted to this outer circle the way the ancient Greeks had seen it. The stars now extend seemingly without limit. So here we have a glimpse, maybe, of an infinite universe.
Sì, nel caso di Thomas Digges riesce nel suo almanacco, nel suo volume, che è la traduzione in inglese, contiene la traduzione in inglese da Copernico, una immagine in cui le stelle sono descritte al di fuori di un cerchio delimitato, quindi descrive per la prima volta uno spazio infinito. E questa idea che probabilmente colpisce gli intellettuali dell'epoca, compreso anche Shakespeare. Questo punto non vediamo più le immagini nella presentazione di Dan Fogg. Forse? Sì, probably you should operate on your presentation, because now we can see just your image, but not the PowerPoint presentation. So some problems from you.
Yes, I can try to reload it.
Yeah.
Let me try. So maybe you couldn't see the diagram. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me see. One moment.
Sì, dobbiamo dire che rapidamente questa è la prima connessione in videoconferenza di Dan in Italia, e quindi è per noi motivo di tanto complicazioni tecniche facilmente risolvibili ma anche comprensibili. Poi è una modalità che stiamo provando con lui e siamo particolarmente contenti, orgogliosi di questa cosa, ma i problemi tecnici sono inevitabili. Ora possiamo vedere. Dan, we can see now the diagram.
Good. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is the diagram that I was mentioning, where the universe seems to go without limit. So you can ask, is there any sign of this in Hamlet or elsewhere in Shakespeare? And I want to point to some dialogue in Act 2, Scene 2, and the question that so Hamlet is conversing with the two courtiers, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. These were old schoolmates, and they're talking about whether or not Denmark is a really horrible place. And Hamlet says, he says it's like a prison. And Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, well enough to say it's quite nice that they don't feel that way. They don't share Hamlet's view. So Hamlet says, "Why then, 'tis none to you. It's not a prison to you," he says. "For there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. To me it is a prison." And Rosencrantz says, "Why then your ambition makes it one, 'tis too narrow for your mind." But Hamlet has the last word. He says, "Oh God, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams." So this phrase, king of infinite space, is very unusual. It's not something you see very much in Renaissance literature, and even Shakespeare uses the word infinite a very small number of times, and never talking about spatial extent, extent of physical space, except for this passage in Hamlet. So it's very interesting, and a few scholars have said maybe it's a reference to this remarkable idea that his countryman Thomas Digges had recently put forward.
Ok, sì, il lavoro del ricercatore è questo, aver trovato un aggettivo infinite che viene usato pochissimo da Shakespeare e probabilmente è messo in relazione con l'idea che il suo connazionale, nonché anche conoscente, amico, Dan ci dice nel libro che si abitavano vicini a Londra, nella città di Londra, appunto aveva utilizzato sia come immagine che come espressione Thomas Digges, lo vedete segnalato, questo infinitely extended. E durante una conversazione tra Amleto e Rosencrantz e Guildenstern, i suoi amici di vecchia data, viene utilizzata questa espressione, dice Amleto: "Io potrei anche essere chiuso in un guscio di noce, però considerarmi re di uno spazio infinito", ed è probabilmente una delle pochissime volte in cui viene utilizzato questo aggettivo, molto significativo. Ok?
Let me say a bit more about a connection to Tycho Brahe. So these connections are very interesting because Tycho Brahe plays a role and Thomas Digges play a role, and they live in different countries, but these are men of science or early scientists are exchanging their ideas with one another. Let me just explain that Tycho Brahe, after he observed the supernova, became very famous, and the King of Denmark gave him his own island, and you see it there in the picture. This is the island of Wien, in between Denmark and Sweden. And you have some people from Sweden in the audience, so that's wonderful. They probably know about this island. Today it's part of Sweden, actually. And Tycho builds this very grand observatory, and it's located, here you can see where it is. It's in the channel, as I say, between Denmark and Sweden. And if you look closely at this diagram from around 1600, you see a castle. And this is not just any castle, it's the castle adjacent to the town of Helsinor in Danish, or as we would say in English, Elsinore. So in other words, this is the castle that Shakespeare chooses as the setting for Hamlet, and look where it is. It's within a few miles of Tycho Brahe's island. So it's very interesting. Yeah, Shakespeare didn't, Shakespeare never visited there, but some of his friends from the acting company did. We know that some of his friends performed at the castle here. And even King James, before he became king, visited Tycho Brahe on his island. So these are some very interesting connections between the astronomer Tycho Brahe and Shakespeare's play Hamlet.
E Dan ha anche trovato una serie di indizi che sono così clamorosi da rappresentare una prova in realtà, perché Tycho Brahe, il famoso astronomo danese, operò in una isoletta, l'isoletta di Wien o di Vel, che è assolutamente di fronte a poche miglia di distanza dal castello di Elsinore. Su questa isoletta aveva ha avuto l'autorizzazione dal re di Danimarca di fondare, di creare un osservatorio astronomico, all'epoca una straordinaria opportunità. E tra l'altro la compagnia, attori della compagnia di Shakespeare e lo stesso re Giacomo I avevano visitato quest'isoletta, erano andati a trovare Tycho Brahe, quindi di sicuro c'era una conoscenza indiretta, perché probabilmente Shakespeare non è mai uscito dai suoi confini, dai confini dell'Inghilterra, voglio dire, però riferimenti indiretti al lavoro di questo astronomo sicuramente poi possono essere stati utilizzati in Amleto. Okay.
And continuing with this, exploring these connections, we can look at the cast of characters in Hamlet, and you look at the names, and they have a sort of classical sounding names, you know, Claudius, Polonius, Ophelia, Horatio, but there's an exception. There are two names that stand out. And the names Rosencrantz and Guildenstern do not sound or look like the other names. So, in fact, they're the only names that really, these are very Danish names, right? The others just sound, you know, traditional. But Rosencrantz and Guildenstern have these wonderful little Danish sounding names. So we can ask, where did Shakespeare get these names from? And here, once again, we go back to our friend, the astronomer Tycho Brahe. As I mentioned, he was conducting these observations from his observatory on the island of Hyen, and he wanted everyone to know how smart he was, right? So he has a printing press on the island. He is publishing his observations. He is sending copies of the observations to other astronomers and mathematicians around Europe, and one of the things he includes is this engraving. It's a professional copper plate engraving from, I think, the 1590s. And what you see, of course, that's Tycho himself in the middle, looking very proud and pompous. But then around it, you see the family crests of some of his distinguished relatives. He's including this because, of course, he wants you to know that he's related to these other very important noble families. And when you take a closer look at the engraving, sure enough, you see Rosencrantz and you see Guildenstern. So this is very interesting. I did not discover this. You know, historians have noticed this, I don't know, 80 or 90 years ago, but people don't seem to, you know, sort of been forgotten, right? So people notice this and then they forget about it, and then sometimes they find it again. But it's very, very interesting. I talk about this a bit more in the book, but it's very possible that Shakespeare saw the engraving. It's possible that a copy was sent to the astronomer Thomas Digges. So I'm not saying this is necessarily where Shakespeare got the names, but it is possible that Shakespeare saw the engraving with his own eyes when he was visiting Thomas Digges. Unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about some of the other connections to the Digges family. But I think this is really remarkable, and again, it's you know, so many people are fans of Shakespeare but have never heard of Tycho Brahe, and I just think this is a very interesting connection. You know, not completely crazy, right? There could be something to it.
Sì, questo non è stata una scoperta di danni, ma in realtà già 80-90 anni fa alcuni critici avevano individuato questo riferimento. Di che cosa si tratta, se l'avete inteso? Che nello stemma araldico, le connessioni familiari che Tycho aveva e che voleva pubblicizzare, perché gli piaceva così, farsi notare, si faceva ritrarre e mandava copie un po' in giro per l'Europa, anche a Thomas Digges, che era in rapporti epistolari con lui. Tra le famiglie nobili che appunto lui aveva come relazione, ce ne sono due, quella denominata Rosencrantz e l'altra Guildenstern. e non può essere un caso, sono gli unici due personaggi con cognome danese nell'opera. Leto, tutti gli altri avete visto prima nomi più o meno classici: Ofelia, Polonio, Claudio, Gertrude, Orazio, lo stesso Amleto. Questi due nomi, questi due cognomi sono tipicamente danesi, collegabili direttamente a Tico e a sua volta collegabili a Thomas Dix, che era un amico, diciamo, di famiglia dello stesso Shakespeare. Questo a dimostrazione del fatto che, diciamo, che il modo scientifico tra personaggi e teorie è penetrato nelle opere di Shakespeare, neanche tanto in maniera nascosta, ma abbastanza visibile. Ok?
So I know I'm running out of time, so just a few final thoughts. I didn't say very much about Galileo. Of course, there is more that I could say in the book, especially in chapter 9. I talk about I think a very interesting connection between Galileo's discoveries and Shakespeare's play Cymbeline. So Cymbeline is one of the final Shakespeare plays, and I think you see some very interesting hints at Galileo's telescopic work. And I guess I can also say, just very briefly, the Italian philosopher and mystic Giordano Bruno has often been said to have a Shakespeare connection. This is difficult, very difficult to really prove, but Bruno, who of course was executed, those of you who have been to the Campo de Fiore, am I saying it right? The square in Rome,
yeah,
the square of flowers.
Campo de Fiore.
Yes. So you've seen the beautiful statue of Giordano Bruno. You know about how he was burned at the stake. But he visited England, and he gave lectures at Oxford, and he stayed for a while in London. But whether he knew, whether he ever encountered Shakespeare, we have no evidence. But nonetheless, we think that he and Shakespeare had a mutual friend, John Florio. John Florio is the man who translated various Italian and French works into English, and we think this is how Shakespeare had access to those works, including, for example, the writings of Montaigne, the French essayist. So these are interesting connections that perhaps we will never have a very clear picture of. But I hope in my book I've given people something to think about. A new facet or a new angle from which to think about Shakespeare's life and Shakespeare's time, his role as a transitional figure when these earlier ways of thinking were gradually giving way to more modern ideas. So I guess that concludes the formal part of my presentation. So grazie, thank you very much for listening, and of course I'm very happy to answer questions.
Okay, thank you. Però ha stabilito un po' quelle che sono nel suo libro le Italian Connections.